I'm Mike Burnett. Welcome to The Real Squabble. Today, we're going to talk about pro-life versus pro-choice. What does it mean? Who's right? Melissa Ann Sturdivant, am I saying your name right?
That's right.
Okay, and Dr. David Miller are here to help us unpack these issues. Melissa is a client services coordinator at Help Pregnancy Center in Indian Trail, North Carolina. And Dr. David Miller is a rural family physician in Idaho and the Idaho director of the American Academy of Medical Ethics, and just came out of a C-section procedure this morning, or getting ready to go in. Which is it?
No, just came out.
Okay.
I came out, baby came out, everything came out fine.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. It's always, it's wonderful, and it's a joy to see a new life come into the world. One side on this issue seems to be occupied with women's rights. Okay. Alternatively, the other is associated with saving babies. In reality, both the pro-life and pro-choice stances have complex motives, objectives, and at times, I'm sure we've all heard the harsh misconceptions. Some of them we'll discuss today among the group. But before we jump into the topic, let me remind you to follow us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Real Squabble. We won't call it The Squaddle this year. I'll say right off the bat that I am personally for equality for everyone, for the best of women's health care, and hold that the more helpless a creature, the more entitled it is to protection by man from cruelty, right? I believe that children are the most helpless and never consider an act of violence as a solution to a problem, any kind of problem. So today I would like us to try to fairly and sensitively discuss the abortion issue. Melissa, let me start off with you. Okay. How did you get involved with the pro-life, pro-choice debate, and why do you think that it's so divisive?
Well, Mike, thanks for having me. I have been involved in pro-life activism in some form since about 2004. When I became a Christian, I recognized that this was a topic that I didn't hear a lot about, and I didn't know how to think well on. So I kind of just jumped in and just started doing my own research, to kind of figure out where I stood on the issue, and because I just didn't hear it talked about. I had known, like in college, and that I knew of I had not had an abortion personally, but I'd known of many people who had, and it just never was talked about afterwards. And I did see some of the destruction that happened in lives of those around me because of abortion. And so it just caused me to start to think deeper about the issue. And once I started diving in, I recognized that I was in territory that I felt like I had no choice but to get involved.
And when you get involved, are those conversations typically friendly?
There's a wide variety. Definitely. My approach is to have friendly dialogue. I found that to be the most effective. I found that to have the most impact is just laying out, a case for life from different areas, whether it be theological and biblical, whether it be scientific, whether it be philosophical. So I found that just laying out a case, and ultimately people have to look at the evidence for themselves. So I don't take personal offense. I know what I believe is the truth on this issue that I've researched and studied, and that my heart has been convicted on by God. And so, I definitely leave that to him to work those things out, and for one to work through those questions. But yeah, so they vary. I mean, many times you are attacked, unfortunately. And I just, try to diffuse those discussions and bring it back to the core issues of what we're looking at, and instead of anything on a personal level.
Right. Hey, Dr. Miller, you always hear people say, trust the science. And you heard Melissa talk about when she became a Christian and talking about the Bible. Does the science somehow miraculously change when you change your faith?
That's a really great question, Mike. The science doesn't change with the addition of faith, but what changes oftentimes is people's perspective on the science and how people interact with the science. Whether we want to admit it or not, even as objective physicians and scientists, we're all pulled in various directions based on our own bents and ideas and opinions about things. And so, you can have two groups of physicians sitting in a room evaluating the same science and come to different opinions about what to do.
Right.
Part of that is the art of medicine along with the science of medicine, but part of that is just the different ideologies that we bring to the table when we come. And so a lot of the time, when you're dealing with something like the abortion debate, I tend to find very little of the debate dealing with science, and much more of the debate is dealing with matters that are more theological and philosophical and political. Sometimes more so than people want to admit, and I'm sure Melissa's seen the same thing.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Right. Kevin, it seems like I've heard you in some conversations where, and I know I've heard J.P. Moreland talk about it, where he has had conversations with folks saying that the science is less settled than some of the philosophy, some of the moral philosophy of how we approach life.
Because scientific methodology is neutral, but philosophy of science is not neutral. There's an undergirding philosophy that comes, just as Dr. Miller was saying, that comes from the various worldviews and perspectives. That makes it especially difficult in the application of the science. Not the science qua science, but the way it is applied. And that's where most of the debate seems to lie.
Right. We'll move into some of those questions, but right off the top, people are asking questions to themselves that they always repeat back to me when I bring up the topic, and those are the issues of autonomy, rape, and incest. Right. So let's look at those separately, Melissa. What about the autonomy of the woman? What rights does the woman have just as a person going through this?
Yeah, I mean, personal autonomy is something that is, I think, important to all of us. We want to be able to make our own choices regarding our lives, the destinies of our lives, and how we live our lives. And so that's something within humans across the board that we hold dear for the most part. When we're dealing with the issue of abortion, we're transitioning, however, into an issue of a human being and their rights and their own life and their own value. So we're dealing with a distinct other individual here, and we have to therefore distinguish the personal autonomy and rights and personal bodily rights of a woman who is pregnant in these situations, who has rights to make various choices, obviously. And then we have to distinguish and look at the value of human life itself as we look at this distinct, different person and what exactly we're dealing with. What is the unborn? And does this unborn, what I would consider an unborn human person, what are their rights? What are their bodily rights and personal rights? So, there's these distinct lines here of what we have to make clear of what we're actually dealing with here.
Right. That seems to be where the rub is, right? Is the fetus human? And is it a human person? And when does that start? And when does it transition into something else? From a medical position, what would you say, Dr. Miller?
So that really is the salient point in the discussion. And and from a medical perspective, we there's a couple of fairly complex issues. Um, there's this whole idea of personhood, which is not a medical category. It's not a medical distinction. Personhood is a theological and a philosophical notion. As a Christian physician, the foundation of my medical ethic is imago Dei, that we're all created in the image of God, and therefore, as a result of that, have unique worth and value apart from anything else, apart from any capacity that we have to interact or contribute to society or anything like that. So, I would take a stance very opposite that of, say, Steven Pinker. Um, and But in terms of you take that and you transition that into the complex milieu of medicine, and now you have this idea of we talk about these categories of a viable versus a non-viable baby. Sometimes people use the word fetus or embryo. In situations of extreme emergency where lives are at stake, those are important topics in the conversation. But if we're just simply talking about a normal, healthy pregnancy, then to me that becomes a very artificial boundary where we're going to say up to this point it's perfectly fine to end this pregnancy because I simply don't want it anymore, versus we have a disastrous situation where the baby is no longer viable. There's no chance of the baby living, and if we don't intervene, then the mom is going to die. And those are those exceptions that people feel like they need to craft into law that create lots of controversy, and most of those are not controversial at all. Even pro-life obstetricians recognize those medical emergencies where intervention has to happen in order to save the life of the mother. So really, it comes down to people, for philosophical and political reasons, wanting to define life as being valuable only when certain preconditions are met.
And certainly, what did you call it? A valid life? What was the word?
Viability. So viability in terms of medicine, talking about a baby, is if we deliver this baby today, is this baby going to be able to survive on its own?
Right.
And
I have, and I know maybe, you only hear of them anecdotally, but I personally have a cousin who, this is where the science wasn't exact. They told the mother she needed to abort because the pregnancy wasn't viable. She was going to have all sorts of medical health problems. The situation was dire. The baby was born. The young girl is brilliant and beautiful. And doing very well. So that decision seems to be, I know it's an educated scientific guess, but that oftentimes, would you say that leads to the philosophical worldview of the physician doing it?
Well, so in terms of medical science, and I'm not an expert in neonatal critical care, but my current understanding is that the current age of viability is somewhere around 23 or 24 weeks. That in the best with the best care possible in U.S. hospitals, babies that are born at 23 to 24 weeks have an extremely reasonable chance of surviving and having a good life. Sometimes there's disability that results from that. But before that, then we tend to say that technology has not progressed to the point that we can really sustain this baby until they can get to the point of being able to survive on their own.
Melissa, I have heard, and jump in.
And so those are the times at which different legislations draw this artificial line in the sand. Before this, it's okay to end a pregnancy. After this, it's not.
Right. Jump in, Kevin, anytime with any of your
questions.
Well,
let me add something that Dr. Miller says, and he's so right about the debate over personhood, and there's so many questions of personhood and so on. Another thing to add to this, which there's a little bit of an overlap, is that is human. Is it human? What is human? How do we define that? What is humanity? And so on. And that's going to be another consideration. Scientists have a pretty good idea, especially when you look at modern humanity. There are certain characteristics going on. Personhood tends to be a little more philosophical.
Yeah.
But a big consideration is it human? And boy, there are arguments for that all the way back to conception, that this is in fact human. Then it becomes the question of, are we going to protect the humans, our fellow humans? And much of the debate comes there. You'll have to forgive me. I'm just now getting over some bronchitis, and you may hear something that sounds like a alley cat wheezing, but I'm just about over on the other side of it. But you may hear some weird sounds from me.
You're sounding great, Kevin. Let me jump in there and let's talk a little bit more about that from the argument of the acorn is what I hear. Maybe you've heard that too, right? Some folks will say, well, an acorn's not an oak tree, but technically an acorn is an oak. It's an oak acorn, right? So that a human, it has all of the potential and everything in it to become an oak tree, even though it's not an oak tree yet. That's the thing I've heard. It seems to me, and just tell me how you think about this, that all of that genetically is in the embryo, the fetus, whatever you're calling that, the same as it is in an acorn. Whether you want to call it a person yet, it seems to be there's no doubt that it's human.
Definitely, yeah. There's definitely some semantics going on there. Like you kind of described with the acorn, all the genetic information, all of those distinctives are there. And we see this with human life. We see, obviously, it's not a potentiality in terms of, yes, growth and development. Yes. Has a human reached their full potential as a fetus, as an embryo? Not yet, but they're still human nonetheless. So we would consider a human or a child in the womb as a individual, a human with potential, but not necessarily a potential human. Like there's not some sort of magical state in development in which there's this crossroads into humanity and into being a person. So again, all of that genetic information, all of that intrinsic, because we're looking at intrinsic values and intrinsic distinctives here that are there within that, just within that genetic code, within that person that makes them who they are from that very first moment of conception. And that, to me, that's just an amazing, even, just from a personal standpoint in terms of my own understanding of my own value and my own purpose, understanding that I am who I was from that very first moment. And so basically all throughout life, that's just being played out and developed more.
Right.
But I was, from that very first moment, I was who I am. And I'm still that same person with, I would say, with distinct purpose and with distinct value. And from that very first moment, and what I do, what I add to the world, what I contribute to society does not diminish nor increase that value from that very first moment of conception.
I would agree. And something we haven't touched on that I also have pondered and find very interesting is the body soul composite that we are. So that when we are created, regardless of whether there is an arm or a leg or whatever the body is composed of, the body is not the person. The person is a composite of the spirit and the body. Without a spirit, you have a corpse. That's something that J.P. Moreland has lectured on oftentimes. So a lot of people have a question about, when it is that, the soul becomes part of it. I would argue that when life begins, that the soul is there. I can't think honestly of another starting point that would happen. Some folks talk about when the baby breathes, and my argument through the years has been, well, the baby's already breathing. It's breathing oxygen through the mother, through the blood, and it seems as though no matter what type of scenario that you apply to the unborn child could be applied to a person that is born outside the womb and going through similar circumstances. Am I wrong?
No, I think that makes sense. I think I've always found the acorn argument to be not very satisfying because, you're making this apples and oranges comparison between a fundamentally different type of life, which is plant life, which JP sometimes makes this strange argument that plants, may have some sort of a rudimentary soul, just in terms of
Animation.
quality of treeness, but plants are not soulish creatures in the same way that animals are. No. And so if you take, for example, if you take a lion and a tiger and you breed them together, you get a liger, and it's a liger from the moment that it's conceived. No one sits back and says once it's born, then it's a liger. It's that from the very beginning. Yeah. And so at the moment of conception, you have this human organism, this human person, and you look back at Aristotle, and to him, this notion of essential nature had everything to do with just what Melissa was talking about, with potentiality. Because people try and make this argument that yes, it has the potential to become a human, but it's really not yet. Well, now you're getting into, Steven Pinker type arguments where, this 5-year-old has the potential to grow up and become something, but they're not that yet. So therefore we can deem them to be expendable if we really want to. And an older person who is demented and has Alzheimer's, or they have some severe debility, they had potential to be a contributing human person, but they're not anymore. So we can, so it really becomes this it really falls under this whole category of A, do they have a voice to speak for themselves? And B, it involves someone else applying this artificial criterion of utilitarian personhood.
Yeah. Kevin, any additions to the concept of the soul and when it might begin and some of the thoughts around that? I've always heard the argument that the soul is the person, the driver of the body. Like the driver is to a car, the soul is to the body. It seems kind of strange that there would be a car with no driver. It seems like something is driving it from the beginning. We have no other indications that I'm aware of that the driver got in down on Main Street, after the car had driven by itself for a while.
Very complex. There's substance dualism, property dualism. They're even among the mind-body philosophers. There's differentiation, but they do have one thing in common, that there is a distinctness between body and soul, as you were saying, Mike. And how they interact and to the extent they interact, that is a huge mystery. But there seems to be this immaterial self literally driving the boat. And I lift my hand. It's this, my physical body responds to this immaterial notion that I have that I want to, lift my hand. Scientists have tried to get back beyond that and to show that it was determined and that it was actually a physical reaction, and then the thoughts followed that. But it seems to be kind of on the other side there. There's this immaterial self.
Yes.
And this goes over to the potential as well, as both of our panelists were talking about, and that is, I heard a pro-choice a very liberal person speaking on Southern California campus, making the argument that you should not end the life of a person in a coma just because they're unconscious, because they have the potential of coming and becoming human.
Mm-hmm.
And then the audience literally started to laugh because he hadn't thought it through. And that is that fetus, that human at conception, has the potential to becoming more developed and so on, and to achieve whatever standard of humanity and personhood that you've established. And so therefore that should be protected. And he ended up just kind of fumbling with his words, but it was, just hadn't thought it through because, as Melissa said, there are a lot of semantics going on, flying all over the place, use of language and so on.
And I would think, if you're of the mind that this is a clump of cells, that you're not going to have a problem with cutting it out, right? If you're of the mind that it is a soul, it was a created being, which I believe there are tremendous arguments that our viewers should look into regarding the soul, the mind, body problem that Kevin brought up. There are very good arguments that we are a soul body composite that most people just don't consider in this argument. They only consider the body, which is valuable because God created it. He ensouled it. And of course, even in our own social settings, civil settings, we want to protect each other. It just, we seem to know that. We seem to know that that's right. So we've got to question, how do we know that? Why do we know that? And why should that be right fundamentally? All right. I think maybe we've hit on that enough. If you want to elaborate some more on that, that's quite all right. One of the most sensitive areas that I encounter, and I will say I'm not cavalier about how I respond to the rape incest issue. I think that is a horrific situation. I can only feel love and compassion for the person that's going through this. I have never gone through that. I can't imagine it, and nor do I really want to. But as I think through it, I try to feel that sensitivity that God would want me to have toward people who are in pain and hurting and suffering. What is it, or how is it that you address these situations, Melissa?
Yes, it definitely a sensitive topic. Something that it becomes more than just a theoretical view, especially, in the work that I do. When you sit down with people who have experienced different levels of abuse on certain levels, I can be transparent enough to share that I have experienced that sort of abuse as well in my past. And so it's been something that has taken a lot of healing and a lot of years of healing and counseling and things that God has brought me through. But yet something that I can ultimately use to help others who are going through and experiencing that shame and guilt. I mean, if we, look at it just from a basic statistical mindset as it relates to abortion, I mean, banning all abortions, except for rape and incest, literally does nothing for the issue, because we're dealing with about 1.5% of abortions. So about give or take 1% due to rape, and maybe less than 0.5%.
You said it does nothing for the issue. See, because from my mind, I've heard Christians in the past say, look, you know what, since we live in the kind of society we do live in, we'll pass legislation that allows for that 1% so that the vast majority of abortions could be prevented. Is that a wrong way to look at it?
It depends on who you're talking to in the Christian community. So I won't say it does nothing for the issue. I think that with the exceptions, you still you're still wiping out. If we do allow for rape and incest, you're still abortion on demand still is highly going to go away. Even if we allow for those exceptions. So it depends on who you talk to in the Christian camp if that's an effective methodology. I think that many times, rape victims and sexual abuse victims are used as a smokescreen to okay and to get society's approval for abortion on demand. And so that, just from an ethical standpoint, I think that that is very, unfortunate. And I think that it does not take into consideration what abuse survivors have to go through and deal with. I will say that abortion itself, in the majority of those who are impregnated through rape or incest do not go through with abortion, do choose to have their children, whether they choose to parent or to place their child for adoption. So again, most of those women impacted don't choose abortion.
Is that a CDC statistic, or where are you getting that from?
That is, I'm trying to think of the exact statistic.
You can send it to me later so I can post it.
I will look it up for you. But yeah, the majority of women do not choose abortion.
What about you always hear about back alleys and coat hangers and people doing their own abortions and things like that. I know it has been a real thing. Is it? But that seems to be the umbrella thing that's brought up, Dave.
So this is one of the big arguments that you hear. And before I go on, I just want to apologize to Steven Pinker. Peter Singer is actually the person I was talking about before. But every time someone brings up if we keep abortion illegal, then it's just going to be this back alley abortion stuff. And then there's this strange notion that somehow or other, by making abortion legal, that these back alley abortionists just go away. Just like in Colorado and Washington and Oregon, when they legalized selling marijuana, all the back alley pot dealers just suddenly went away and went out of business. Well, no, they opened a storefront. And in the same way, when you make abortion legal, a lot of these so-called back alley abortionists just move downtown. And the prime example of that would be Kermit Gosnell in Philadelphia. Back in 2011, some of you guys are probably familiar. Kermit Gosnell was running a women's health clinic providing mostly medical abortions in Chicago, and what eventually came to light is that he was working in just absolutely squalid conditions that were unsanitary, unsafe, various reports have been made about the conditions in which he was operating, and people would come out and do inspections, and nothing was done, and nothing was done, and nothing was done. And eventually, a young immigrant woman seeking refuge in the U.S. came to him, and abortion was performed, and she ended up dying as a result of complications, which kind of led everything to that suddenly the train was out of the station. He eventually was prosecuted, is serving time in prison, was literally charged with serial murder. In fact, even Wikipedia, not necessarily a bastion of conservative thought, calls Kermit Gosnell a serial killer. They found multiple jars of babies' feet that he had kept as trophies. There was just, it was just this horrible situation that was really best described as a back alley abortion clinic that had moved to downtown because it was legal. And a huge proportion of the abortions he was performing were not even legal by Pennsylvania state law at the time. So to me, this is a fundamentally flawed and disingenuous argument that somehow making abortion legal makes it safer. The simple fact of the matter is abortion clinics are not regulated the same way ambulatory surgery centers are. That actually was one of the legal ramifications of the Kermit Gosnell case, and Planned Parenthood and the NAF and various other entities vehemently fought to keep abortion clinics out of the purview of ambulatory surgery centers for regulation. when the Gosnell case showed that they absolutely need to be regulated as such. And it all falls under the guise of, you're creating an undue burden by making this happen. It's like, well, if you have to have all this stuff in place to safely remove gallbladders and appendices, then why does it not make sense to have all these safeguards in place to perform surgical abortion?
Right.
That's an argument that just really kind of annoys me, because it's very disingenuous and is not borne out.
Yeah, and that is an extreme. But what our program is probably going to a lot of people that are in the middle and trying to make some decisions, right, about the right way to turn, what to do, what's available. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of ignorance.
Mike, I do want you to notice a terminology or a term that Melissa used. She said, place the baby in adoptive services. Place the baby. And we've got to be accurate, I think, with our language like that. And because what we say is you give the baby up.
Mm-hmm.
Give the baby up for adoption. Mm-hmm. Give that baby up for adoption. Keep that baby and give that baby up for adoption. It still puts this moral stress on because of that. And so that's what you're doing. It's asking a lot of a young girl, 12, 13, 14, 15, who was raped by an uncle or a father and impregnated and so on.
Yeah.
It's asking a lot for her to carry that baby to term. But when we realize that you can go ahead and do that and then place the baby in adoptive services, that you've done a great thing. And when we teach our children about Ethel Waters, who died in 1977, I believe she was 80 years old. She was the biggest candidate for an abortion I think that ever was. Her mother was 13, raped by a 17-year-old relative. She was born in horrible, Ethel Waters was born in horrible circumstances to this 13-year-old mother. And if you read her biography, His Eyes on the Sparrow, nobody's got a resume like Ethel Waters.
Right.
Academy Award, the first black actress to be nominated for Academy Award. She got award after award, a tremendous singer, movie star, and then traveled the world on the platform with Billy Graham, touching millions of lives.
Yeah, go ahead, Karen.
Anyway, that's it's despite stories like that, and despite that, it's still very difficult. To ask a person to go through that, but when we have our moral moorings, when we have those intact, then we know at least what the framework that we're dealing with when we make the decision.
It seems like such an anguishing Sophie's choice going on there, and depending on, like we said before, whether you believe it's a group of just flesh cells or a creation of God, it's going to weigh heavily on what you do there. But it just is unimaginable to me to ask a young lady to go through something like that. It's
Right.
But I guess it boils down to, what conversation, Melissa, do you have with that young woman, right? Because you just don't come out of the chute with, you're murdering the baby.
No, absolutely not. Right. There's so much emotional trauma that's already taken place, and the act of rape in incest, these are acts of violence. They're acts of control. And so I think I would say in the abortion choice movement, the idea of control has been twisted. For women and girls to feel like they are somewhat in a position of control and power in terms of making these reproductive choices, right? And so I think what we have to do in these cases is to show true dignity, what it means to be truly empowered, right? To be truly empowered is to do the right thing for our fellow man. Okay, that's how we triumph evil. We don't victimize due to being victimized. And we can move from even from a standpoint of being victimized through making a powerful choice, a brave choice. We overcome the evil and harm that was done upon us. And so there is, and we see it throughout. I mean, as believers, we see this throughout scripture. We see this throughout the gospel message, this wonderful and beautiful triumph over evil that happens love and sacrifice.
Right.
So that's what ultimately in these situations is that we're asking and encouraging of these young ladies is sacrifice and love overall. And so depending on how we frame that and present that, and not only just say choose life and just have this baby, pregnancy centers like mine are uniquely trained, and we work through our procedures and through our mentorship through our counseling to walk with these young ladies through these difficult situations, through any sort of crisis pregnancy situation. We are here for them to support them in every way. As I speak, next door, we have a building that is being a whole building addition, a whole 7,300 square foot addition to our building that is specifically designed just to house baby equipment and diapers and formula and supplies. All of this donated, the funds possible for this donated. So that we don't owe a dime to make this happen, so that we can be a more viable resource and a more present resource to those in our community. So there are people, and I can, being here and working here day in and day out and seeing our clients, these women just need support. That's what honestly, no matter your crisis situation that you're in, and this is with all of us, with anything that we're going through, right? We can typically make it through situations if we feel like we are not alone, if we feel that we are supported, and if we feel that we have someone who understands us, genuinely understands us. And so even again, in these worst of the worst situations, that can make all the difference.
Yeah, I don't know of a church group across the country, maybe Jewish and Christian, maybe Muslim as well, that doesn't support pro-life work, right? I've heard that there's more than 2,500 kinds of centers, pregnancy centers like you're at, that don't just focus on that, but like you said, adoption and care for the infant. They're even working with special needs and human trafficking and combating racism, right? Because from the pro-life position, they care about all aspects of life. Right?
And many of our clients, even after, we don't just say, okay, you have the baby, see you later. We have continuing opportunities for counseling and mentorship and discipleship, parenting discipleship, all of these sort of things that are ongoing, even after that child is born into whatever age. So it's not a situation of just, again, just choose life and we're not here to support you through that. Many people put their money where their mouth is. And you're right. Pregnancy centers far outnumber abortion clinics, but we obviously are not funded like abortion clinics.
Right.
We're funded because people care and because people believe in what we're doing and in the sanctity of human life.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems as though you provide, and the average hospital, Dr. Miller, provide the same or better services than any of those quote unquote abortion centers. Even though I do believe they are doing some good things, that service that they do with abortion is abhorrent. So to me, and it seems like women don't need to go there to get support and all those other things that they need.
Right. Well, and one of the things that you see is they they like to talk about Planned Pregnancy provides, much more than just abortion services. And, they provide birth control and various other things. But then you talk to them about, drilling down in women's health services they actually provide. You can't call Planned Parenthood and schedule your mammogram or they'll do a pap smear, they'll do various contraceptive type services. But like you say, there's not a medical service they provide that you can't get from your local doctor, local clinic, whatever So really, the thing that they do that sets them apart from other medical facilities is providing abortion services.
Yeah. Hey, Kevin, you're like me. You're on social media all the time, interacting with some top philosophic leaders in our country, and with people fielding questions and things like that. What kind of what's the temperature from where you sit of how people are responding now? Because it seems like Christians are doing a better job at educating people from a moral position and from a medical position, technology and such.
I think so. And one thing that comes to mind is just that we're going through an especially tense period right now in the country on a multitude of issues, but especially in the issue of pro-life, pro-choice, and that debate, and that with the overthrow of Roe v. Wade, the pro-choice people are very upset. And then the pro-life people are saying, we've got the momentum, let's continue. So there's a real divide right now. If you think about just I can think of very few instances where the House was so divided when the House just passed this Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. And that is, if the child, and Dr. Miller could probably speak to this, but if the child is born alive in an abortion procedure, that child must get medical help. And all of the Republicans voted for it, and all but one of the Democrats voted against it. And that's just how divided we are. Actually, two, but one voted present of the Democrats. And so absolutely divided, on that. And it's a bill to save the child's life in the event that the child is born alive during an abortion.
Well, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say real quick that this is part of also thinking it through. Jerry Nadler, he's a Democratic representative in New York, objected to the part of the bill that instructs doctors to bring the baby to the hospital after administering care, because he said it endangers the baby to travel from the abortion clinic to the hospital. And now wait a minute. The baby that you just tried to kill, you're endangering its life if you take it to the hospital. And that was his argument.
Right.
And so that's not thinking it all the way through.
Well, that quite frankly, that's the words of someone that doesn't do this for a living and has no idea what they're talking about. Because the reality is, I work in a small rural hospital, and if I have a baby that's born that's very sick, they get transferred to another hospital.
Yeah.
And it doesn't endanger the baby's life to do so. In fact, it's absolutely essential to the baby's care. Yeah, they get transferred to a NICU somewhere. I've been involved in several of those situations of trying to support a baby while transport arrives to pack them up and ship them to another hospital. So that's the argument of a politician who just simply doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yeah,
exactly.
I think there seems to be a lot of reasonable people discussing this and learning more about biological life, even if they don't agree about spiritual life, right? But I suppose, to me, say just from a human standpoint, as people trying to survive here on the planet, it seems like there's a natural limit to someone's freedom against violence, right? So that and even if it's reproductive, how far does reproductive freedom go? Can you allow it to go to the point of violence? To me, that's where the rub is. The woman says, it's my body. Okay, it is your body, but there is another body in your body. Does that body, it can't speak for itself, but does it have rights?
Yeah,
Well,
Melissa.
yeah, well,
Melissa addressed
oh,
this too. Let me just say quickly that there's personal autonomy, and then there's a notion of radical autonomy, and we all want personal autonomy, but we will curtail that or stop before we start running over somebody else and
Right.
infringing on them. But then there's a radical autonomy that says everyone else be damned. I'm having my way because I am an autonomous person, and there is a lot of that philosophy. It's the difference between personal autonomy and radical personal autonomy.
Yeah, and there's a state on that spectrum of ignorance is bliss where they say, well, it's only 6 weeks in, my baby hasn't grown a mustache and hailed a taxi yet, so a pill, an abortion, it doesn't have a name. It's a non-person to me. That we just sort of wave that off and just accept it. Should we be accepting that?
So in 2004, the U.S. Congress passed a law, and George Bush signed it, known as the Unborn Victims of Violence Act. And so the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, basically, if someone kills a pregnant woman in an act of violence, then they can be charged with 2 murders. And according to the definition, the legal definition to the Unborn Victims of Violence Act of a child in utero is this: a member of the species Homo sapiens at any stage of development who is carried in the womb. So any stage of development would include conception and all stages there forward. So according to U.S. legal doctrine, to end the life of a child inside its mother's womb by violent means is to be guilty of manslaughter or even murder. But somehow or other, if the woman says, I want to do this, then it makes it okay. So you can't shoot my child, but I can shoot my child.
Okay.
And that,
Hey, we're getting close to the end of the program, and I want to go through. I won't limit it to a final 3 subject, but try to keep it in there and as short as possible, starting with Kevin and then you, Dr. Miller, and then Melissa for the spiritual, the medical, and the resource aspect of things. Kevin, from a Christian standpoint, what do you think the posture should be for us believers with how we interact with folks going through this? We have church members who have kids that get pregnant and go through this, and they have tough times.
Love, understanding, and coming alongside and not abandoning them.
Right.
And then not abandoning them, as Melissa said, after the child is born.
Yes.
Okay, we did our thing. Now, aloneness is a terrible thing. And these young women can be, women of all ages can be very alone.
Right.
So without the heated rhetoric that is bouncing all over our walls these days, we need to take a step back, take a deep breath, be Christ-like, hold firm to what we believe is the moral high ground here. But then love, compassion, and understanding that extends throughout the life of that person, and not just until the baby is born and placed in adoptive services.
Right. Love never means that we're in agreement with the person's choices. If that were the case, God wouldn't love most of us for lots of the choices that we make every day. We need to demonstrate that same kind of love, I think.
And obviously, I mean, women who have had abortions too, who need care through the emotional trauma quite often that comes with that. And or even if not, can not let the rhetoric be so heated that we neglect those who have elected to have an abortion. They need redemption, healing as well.
Yeah. Dr. Miller, as a person who just did a C-section minutes before coming on this program today, what would you say to your fellow physicians around the world and to the laymen, the best way to think about it when they're struggling through these issues?
It's absolutely fundamental medical doctrine that when you're taking care of a pregnant patient, you're taking care of two patients. The medications that you give necessarily change. Everything that you do in the care of this pregnant woman has to accommodate taking care of this baby. Historically, the Hippocratic Oath absolutely prohibited doing anything that would harm either patient. And that has been a radical departure that's occurred in the 20th century. And so, to me, especially in the American Academy of Medical Ethics, one of our foundational values is bringing people back to this historic Hippocratic medicine, where the primary goal is protecting the life and health of our patient. And if it's a pregnant patient, we have two patients that we're taking care of, each of which needs to be valued and cared for.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Melissa, most of the information that I gathered for this program, I got from the CDC and or the Guttmacher, I think is how you say it, Institute.
Mm-hmm.
Are two of the primary places that people look for statistics information on these subjects. The Guttmacher or Guttmacher, I lived in Germany for a while, so I want to say Guttmacher, is more liberal. They're pro-choice organization, but their statistics are trusted for the most part. I hear 1 in 4 women have had an abortion. 5% of abortions are due to rape and incest. 35% of all pregnancies in New York City ended in abortion. They said there's about 1 million abortions a year, I think, just within the United States that occur. If we could even knock it down to the 1.5%, a lot of people would be thrilled to rescue those children. What words of wisdom, what information could you leave us with on this program today?
Oh man, I think this work, as both Dr. Miller and Kevin and yourself have alluded to, it's really about just restoring this culture of life within our society. When it comes to children in the womb, we are dealing with those who are less developed, those who are completely defenseless, those who are dependent for their sustenance. We're dealing with the weak and the vulnerable, the most weak and most vulnerable among us. The question becomes, what do we do with these people? What do we do with the most weakest and the most vulnerable among us? So if we are going to promote an abortion choice culture, then we basically have exerted some level of discrimination, against them, instead of coming to their aid, instead of coming along to bring them into this, to this world, so that they can be loved and cared for in whatever environment that looks like.
Right.
So, and really, the whole culture of life. What do we do with the most innocent and defenseless among us? And that actually carries over into every other area of society. Family, marriage, economics. I mean, it carries over into government and all of those things. So this is not an irrelevant issue. This is something that we all need to wrestle with, and to look at where we stand. And then look deeper within ourselves at, why is this so? If I am landing on this pro-choice position or this abortion choice position, why is this okay for these weak humans to not be protected? It's like you said, it can become abstract to an extent because of the size. And that's why even here with our ultrasounds, every woman that goes through and has a pregnancy test, a positive pregnancy test, we do want her to see her child on the ultrasound machine, because it does, in some sense, solidify what's going on inside of her. But and we encourage, and we have repeat ultrasounds as that child does develop, because that abstract idea that this is just something, a clump of something that's not, that's more theoretical than a reality.
Right.
So yeah, it's just, I think just this whole culture of life and this whole idea of, we don't, especially in this society where we're all about fighting oppression and fighting discrimination. But yet we have a huge segment of our population that is fighting for oppression and is fighting for discrimination, but only against the most innocent and weak and defenseless among us.
That's what I see. Especially the underprivileged communities are hit 400% heavier than other communities. Well, we're going to have to wrap it up there. I see that from my standpoint, I see the sled argument, the size, regardless of the size, the location, the environment, or the development, it is a human. You want to say it's a person or not, it has everything in it to be a human. It boils, sometimes medically it seems sound that it is a person. Spiritually, I think we can argue that it is as well. But we're going to have to stop here. All right. Dr. Miller, thank you. Melissa, Sturdivant, Kevin, for showing up from Texas. Yeehaw. That's going to wrap up the real squabble. The pro-life versus pro-choice debate can be an intimidating issue for a lot of folks. So no matter where you stand, I highly encourage you to do your own research and consider watching an ultrasound and interviews from abortionists and women who have gone through it before you cast your vote publicly in any direction. And I mean Christian and non-Christian. To do that. After all, millions of lives are impacted on this issue. Together, as Kevin was talking about earlier, with truth and love, we can offer hope to many men, women, and children whose lives are also impacted by the abortion choice. Thank you, guys. Please like us on Facebook and share this with your friends and family.